Have you ever felt lost in a wilderness, abandoned by those you trusted, with nowhere to turn? Imagine a moment where every step forward feels like a step deeper into the unknown. Yet somehow, there's a quiet hope that someone, somewhere, is watching over you. Today, we're diving into the story of Hagar and Ishmael, a tale of survival, divine intervention, and the remarkable ways God's grace reaches us when we're at our lowest. If you're new here, welcome to Decode Vale, where we uncover the hidden spiritual truths in the Bible and beyond. Make sure to like this video if you find it meaningful, and don't forget to subscribe for more content that deepens your understanding and enriches your spirit. The story of Hagar and Ishmael is simple, yet it's filled with depth. It's about a woman cast out, left to wander in the desert with her son. She feels abandoned, desperate. But then, in her darkest hour, God speaks to her. He promises her that her son will survive and thrive, and through this, we learn something profound. Even when life seems harsh, there is hope. There's a plan. This story isn't just about the past. It's about us. It shows that faith isn't just for the good times. It's what we cling to when everything else falls away. Stay with us as we explore what Hagar's journey teaches us about survival, faith, and the silent, guiding hand of God. Abram's concern over heirs. Abram sat beneath the darkened sky, his thoughts heavy. His life had been a journey of faith, filled with promises from God, yet one longing remained unfulfilled. He had no son, no heir to carry on his name. Each night, he looked at his household, where Eliezer, his faithful servant, would inherit everything. Eliezer was loyal, but he was not Abram's flesh and blood. This thought gnawed at Abram, a reminder that his legacy might end with him. One night, in the quiet of his camp, Abram spoke to God, his voice tinged with frustration and sorrow. "O Lord God, what will you give me, for I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." Abram's heart was laid bare. He had wealth, he had land, but what was it all worth if he had no son to inherit it? God listened to Abram's plea. This was not the first time Abram had questioned the divine plan, but God's patience with Abram was endless. God's response was simple, yet profound. He reassured Abram that Eliezer would not be his heir. Instead, God promised that Abram's own flesh and blood would carry on his legacy. Then, in a moment of deep intimacy between the Creator and his servant, God led Abram outside. The night sky stretched above them, clear and vast, dotted with countless stars. God told Abram to look up, to count the stars if he could. The stars were too many, too far beyond Abram's ability to number them all. And then, God made a promise that would echo through the generations, "So shall your offspring be." This promise was not just about the number of descendants Abram would have. It was a promise of a future filled with life and continuity, a reassurance that God had a plan far greater than Abram could imagine. The stars in the sky became a symbol of hope and faith, a reminder that even in his old age, Abram was not forgotten. His descendants would be as numerous as the stars, a multitude that would one day become nations. Abram believed God's promise. Despite his doubts, despite his age, he held on to the belief that God's word would come to pass. Yet, the path to fulfilling this promise would not be straightforward. Sarai, his wife, was still barren, and time was running out. The weight of this promise, while comforting, also carried a burden of waiting and uncertainty. As time passed, the lack of a child began to weigh heavily on both Abram and Sarai. They knew God had made a promise, but how long would they have to wait? Sarai, desperate for a solution, decided to take matters into her own hands. She offered her Egyptian servant, Hagar, to Abram, hoping that through her, they might finally have the child they so deeply desired. This decision, born out of impatience and desperation, would set the stage for the birth of Ishmael. It was a human attempt to fulfill a divine promise, a move that would bring its own set of challenges and consequences. But even in this, God's promise to Abram remained unshaken. The stars still shone brightly above, a constant reminder of what was yet to come. In the quiet moments of doubt and uncertainty, Abram returned to that night under the stars. He held on to the memory of God's voice, the promise that had been made. And though the journey would take twists and turns, though the waiting would test his faith, Abram knew that the God who had promised was faithful. The stars in the sky were more than just a promise, they were a covenant, an unbreakable bond between Abram and his God. As we trace the unfolding events that lead to the birth of Ishmael, we see the complexity of human emotion intertwined with divine will. Abram's story is not just one of faith, but of struggle, doubt, and the longing for assurance. Yet, through it all, the promise remains, guiding Abram toward a future he cannot yet see but believes in with all his heart. The stars above continue to shine, a silent testimony to a promise that will soon begin to take shape in the life of Ishmael, Abram's firstborn son. Sarai's desperation and Hagar's role. Sarai watched the years slip by, each one a reminder of the child she had never born. Her heart ached with an emptiness that only those who have longed for a child can truly understand. She had heard God's promise to Abram, that he would father a nation, but how could this be when her womb remained barren? Sarai felt the weight of her failure every day. In a world where a woman's worth was tied to her ability to bear children, Sarai's barrenness was a heavy burden, one that cast a shadow over every aspect of her life. Desperation can drive people to places they never thought they would go. Sarai, once a woman of dignity and strength, found herself cornered by her own despair. She saw no other way to fulfill the promise made to Abram, no other way to secure her place in the unfolding of God's plan. So, she turned to a custom of the time, a practice that society accepted but one that carried deep, personal cost. She offered her Egyptian slave, Hagar, to Abram as a surrogate. This was not a decision made lightly, but it was made out of desperation. Sarai knew that if Hagar bore a child, it would legally be considered Sarai's. Yet, the very thought of this act must have weighed heavily on her conscience. Hagar was not just a slave, she was a person, with her own thoughts, her own fears. But in that moment, Sarai's desperation overshadowed her compassion. In the cultural context of the time, a slave's body was not her own. Hagar had no say in the matter. Her role was to obey, to submit to the will of her mistress, no matter how personal the demand. The power dynamics were clear, Sarai was the mistress, Hagar the servant. The decision was made for her, and she had no choice but to comply. This was not just a matter of tradition, it was a stark reminder of Hagar's position in a world that valued her only for what she could provide to her owners. Hagar became pregnant, and with that, the household changed. What should have been a moment of joy quickly became a source of tension and strife. Hagar's pregnancy was a reminder to Sarai of her own barrenness, a symbol of what she could never achieve. This led to a shift in their relationship. Sarai began to see Hagar not just as a slave, but as a rival, someone who had succeeded where she had failed. As the pregnancy progressed, Hagar's attitude may have shifted too. She was no longer just a slave, she was carrying Abram's child, a child that would be considered Sarai's heir. Perhaps Hagar began to feel a sense of pride, or maybe even resentment towards Sarai. The power dynamic between them had altered, and with it came new tensions. Sarai sensed this change, and it festered into bitterness and jealousy. Sarai's bitterness grew, fueled by her sense of betrayal, not by Hagar, but by the situation itself. She had orchestrated this plan, yet now it seemed to mock her. Every glance at Hagar's swelling belly was a reminder of her own emptiness. The plan that was supposed to bring her joy now brought her nothing but pain. Sarai's frustration turned inward, and then outward, towards Hagar. She began to treat Hagar harshly, punishing her for the very thing she had been ordered to do. Hagar found herself in an increasingly hostile environment. The home where she had once served faithfully now felt like a prison. The life growing inside her, which should have been a blessing, became a source of her suffering. The relationship between Sarai and Hagar had soured, and it was clear that something had to give. The situation was unbearable for Hagar. The tension, the harsh treatment, the loneliness, eventually, it drove her to flee. Pregnant and alone, she ran into the wilderness, away from the life she had known, away from the pain. Hagar's flight was not just an act of desperation, it was an act of survival. She sought refuge in the desert, perhaps hoping to find some peace, some relief from the torment she had faced. But the wilderness was unforgiving, and Hagar was soon confronted with the reality of her situation. Alone and vulnerable, she must have felt abandoned by all, by Sarai, by Abram, and perhaps even by God. Yet, in her moment of deepest despair, when all seemed lost, a divine encounter awaited her. But that is a story for another time. In this moment, Sarai's desperation had set into motion a chain of events that would shape not just her own life, but the lives of countless others. The bitterness, the jealousy, the sense of betrayal, all these emotions swirled together, leading to conflict and division. Yet, even in this, there was a thread of divine purpose, one that would ultimately weave together a larger narrative of faith, survival, and the complex relationship between human decisions and God's will. Tensions between Sarai and Hagar. Sarai watched Hagar, with a mix of bitterness and envy. What had once been a desperate plan to bring a child into her life had turned into a source of constant pain. Hagar's growing belly was a daily reminder of Sarai's own barrenness, a cruel irony that cut deeper with each passing day. She felt wronged, not just by Hagar, but by God himself. Hadn't he promised Abram an heir? Yet here she was, still childless, while her servant carried the child that would be her husband's legacy. This bitterness gnawed at Sarai's soul. She had sacrificed her pride, her dignity, by offering Hagar to Abram, only to find herself overshadowed by the very woman she had tried to use as a solution. The plan had backfired. Instead of bringing her joy, it had created a rift between her and Hagar, a tension that grew stronger with each glance, each whispered word in the household. Hagar, for her part, was no longer the submissive servant Sarai had known. Pregnancy had changed her. She now carried Abram's child, and with that came a sense of importance she had never felt before. Perhaps she began to see herself differently, not just as a slave, but as the mother of Abram's firstborn. This new identity might have sparked a change in her behavior, a subtle shift in the way she interacted with Sarai. Sarai sensed this change. She saw it in the way Hagar carried herself, in the looks she gave, in the unspoken tension that filled the air whenever they were in the same room. Hagar's very presence became a source of resentment for Sarai. What once was a symbol of hope now felt like a daily reminder of her own inadequacy. The tension between them simmered, growing hotter with each passing day. Sarai's envy and bitterness fueled her anger, and that anger found its outlet in Hagar. She began to mistreat Hagar, asserting her authority in cruel ways. Perhaps it was small things at first, a harsh word, an extra chore, But it didn't stop there. The mistreatment became more pronounced, more deliberate, as Sarai sought to reassert her control over a situation that felt increasingly out of her hands. For Hagar, the situation became unbearable. She had no power to fight back, no way to defend herself. She was a slave, bound by the will of her mistress, but now she found herself caught in a conflict she had not chosen. The hostility from Sarai was relentless, and with no one to turn to, Hagar's sense of isolation deepened. The household, once a place of relative stability for Hagar, had become a battlefield. Every encounter with Sarai was a reminder of her lowly status, of the fact that despite carrying Abram's child, she was still just a servant, subject to her mistress's whims. The tension that had begun with silent resentment now erupted into open conflict. Sarai's harshness knew no bounds, and Hagar's situation grew more desperate by the day. Finally, the pressure became too much. Hagar could no longer endure the mistreatment, the bitterness that poisoned every interaction with Sarai. She made a decision that was both bold and dangerous: she would flee. Alone, pregnant, and with nowhere to go, Hagar chose the uncertainty of the wilderness over the certainty of Sarai's cruelty. The wilderness was a harsh and unforgiving place, but for Hagar, it represented freedom, a chance to escape the life that had become unbearable. She fled into the desert, driven by fear, anger, and the overwhelming need to find some peace, some relief from the constant torment. The decision to flee was not made lightly. It was a last resort, a desperate attempt to take control of her life, even if it meant risking everything. As Hagar wandered into the barren landscape, she left behind not just the physical confines of Abram's household, but also the suffocating tension that had driven her to this point. The wilderness was vast and empty, a place where she could be alone with her thoughts, where the weight of Sarai's bitterness could no longer reach her. But the wilderness was not just a place of escape, it was a place of encounter. Here, away from the eyes of her tormentors, Hagar would soon find herself face to face with the divine, in a moment that would change her life forever. The tension that had driven her from Abram's household had not been the end of her story, only the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would discover that even in the depths of despair, she was not alone. Hagar's encounter with the divine. Hagar ran, the desert stretching out endlessly before her. The heat pressed down, unyielding, and the barren landscape offered no comfort, only silence. She fled without direction, driven by a need to escape the cruelty that had become her life. Each step took her further from Sarai's harsh words and Abram's indifferent gaze, but it also took her deeper into isolation. There was no one to turn to, no shelter to seek. The wilderness was vast, empty, and unforgiving, a mirror of the despair that filled her heart. The sun beat down as she wandered, lost and alone. Her strength waned, her hope fading with each passing hour. What had started as a desperate flight for freedom now felt like a march toward death. The thought of her unborn child gnawed at her. What kind of life awaited this child if they survived? The desert seemed to swallow her whole, her cries for help absorbed into the void. In her mind, she was truly alone, abandoned by her masters, by society, and by God. But the wilderness, though harsh, was not godless. In her deepest despair, when all seemed lost, Hagar encountered something unexpected, a presence that broke through her isolation. As she slumped beside a spring of water, exhausted and broken, an angel appeared before her. This was not a vision of terror, but of hope. The angel's words were gentle, but firm, cutting through the hopelessness that had settled in her soul. "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" the angel asked. It was a question that reached beyond the physical journey she was on and touched the deeper journey of her heart. Where was she going? What future could she possibly hope for? The angel didn't wait for her answer. Instead, he spoke words that were both surprising and challenging: "Return to your mistress and submit to her." It was not what Hagar had wanted to hear. The thought of returning to the life she had just fled was unbearable. Yet, there was more. The angel carried a message that held within it a promise, a future that Hagar had not dared to dream of. "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count," the angel said. The words were astounding. They echoed the promise that God had made to Abram, a promise of countless descendants. But here, in the wilderness, this promise was being extended to Hagar, a slave, an outsider. It was a promise of a future, of hope, in the midst of what seemed like a hopeless situation. The angel continued, instructing Hagar to name her son Ishmael, which means God hears. It was a name that would forever remind her that even in the wilderness, even in her despair, God had heard her cries. The God who had seemed so distant was, in fact, near. He had seen her suffering, heard her pain, and responded with a promise that her son would not just survive, but thrive. Hagar must have felt a mix of emotions: relief, fear, confusion. The path ahead was still daunting, but now she had something she hadn't had before, a promise from God. The wilderness had not been the end of her story, but the place where God met her in her need. And it was here that God revealed himself to her in a way that was deeply personal and profoundly comforting. In that moment, Hagar gave a name to the Lord who had spoken to her. She called him El Roi, which means the God who sees me. It was a declaration of faith, a recognition that she had not been abandoned after all. God had seen her in her suffering, and he had come to her in her despair. El Roi was not a distant deity, but a personal God who knew her by name, who understood her pain, and who had a plan for her life and the life of her child. The significance of El Roi goes beyond Hagar's story. It speaks to all who have ever felt unseen, unheard, or forgotten. It is a reminder that in our darkest moments, when we feel most isolated and alone, God is there. He sees us, hears us, and cares for us. This encounter in the wilderness is more than just a story of survival, it is a testament to the divine presence that walks with us through our own deserts, our own moments of despair. At Decode Vale, we believe that these ancient stories carry timeless truths. The story of Hagar and El Roi is one that resonates with the struggles we all face at different points in our lives. It reminds us that no matter how lost or abandoned we may feel, there is a God who sees us, who knows our pain, and who is ready to meet us in our wilderness. We are not alone, and our stories are not forgotten. As you reflect on Hagar's encounter with the divine, consider your own life. Where have you felt unseen or unheard? Where have you been wandering in your own wilderness? And in those moments, have you sensed the presence of El Roi, the God who sees? We invite you to explore these questions with us as we continue to uncover the hidden truths in these ancient narratives, finding meaning and hope for our lives today. Birth of Ishmael and the resurgence of conflict. The day Ishmael was born, there was no celebration. No joyful cries, no gathering of friends and family. His birth was shrouded in tension, the air thick with unspoken resentment. Hagar held her son close, feeling the weight of the moment. Ishmael was her child, flesh of her flesh, but in the eyes of the household, he was still the son of a slave. And for Sarai, the arrival of this child was a bitter reminder of everything she had yet to receive. Sarai watched from a distance, her emotions a storm beneath a calm surface. She had orchestrated this, yet now she found herself unable to reconcile the reality of it. Ishmael was Abram's son, but he was not hers. Hagar, once a servant, now held something Sarai could never have. The tension between them grew, silent and pervasive, casting a shadow over every interaction. Hagar's newfound status as the mother of Abram's firstborn did nothing to lessen the hostility that Sarai harbored. Years passed, and in that time, Sarai's bitterness only deepened. But then, miraculously, her own prayers were answered. Against all odds, Sarai gave birth to a son, Isaac. This should have been a moment of pure joy, but instead, it reignited old conflicts. Isaac was the child of promise, the one through whom God's covenant with Abram would be fulfilled. But Ishmael was still there, a constant reminder of Sarai's earlier desperation, and the complicated dynamics that now defined their household. The tension that had simmered for years finally boiled over when Sarai saw Ishmael playing with Isaac. There was something about the way Ishmael interacted with her son that triggered a deep-seated fear and jealousy within her. Ishmael, the older boy, seemed to mock Isaac. Perhaps it was just the rough play of children, or maybe it was more. To Sarai, it felt like a threat, an omen of conflict between her son and the child of Hagar. Sarai couldn't bear it. The sight of Ishmael, laughing and playing with Isaac, was too much for her. She went to Abram, her voice filled with a cold, determined edge. "Cast out this slave woman with her son," she demanded, "for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." Her words were sharp, final. For Sarai, there could be no coexistence between the two boys. Isaac's future had to be secured, and that meant Ishmael and Hagar had to go. Abram listened to Sarai's demand with a heavy heart. Ishmael was his son, his firstborn. The idea of sending him away was unbearable. He had watched the boy grow, had seen the spark of life in his eyes, and had loved him as any father would. But Abram was also a man of faith, and he knew that this was not just a matter of family dynamics, it was about the future that God had promised. Abram wrestled with the decision. He knew that sending Hagar and Ishmael away would condemn them to a life of hardship, possibly even death. The desert was unforgiving, and the thought of them wandering, alone and vulnerable, filled him with dread. But God spoke to Abram, reassuring him that this was the right course of action. "Do not be distressed because of the boy and your slave woman," God said. "Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." With a heavy heart, Abram did as God instructed. Early the next morning, he gathered provisions, bread and a skin of water, and gave them to Hagar. He placed the supplies on her shoulder, his face etched with sorrow. Ishmael stood by, confused, perhaps sensing that something was terribly wrong. There were no words that could make this moment easier, no explanation that could soften the blow. Abram could only watch as Hagar took her son by the hand and walked away, into the wilderness. The journey was harsh. The provisions Abram had given them were meager, barely enough to sustain them for long. The desert stretched out before them, a vast, unyielding landscape. Hagar's heart ached with each step, the weight of the water skin digging into her shoulder, the weight of her situation digging into her soul. She looked at Ishmael, the child she had carried and nursed, and now carried again, this time toward an uncertain fate. As the sun climbed higher, their strength began to fade. The water ran out, the bread was gone, and the desert showed no mercy. Desperation took hold. Hagar placed Ishmael under a bush, shielding him from the worst of the heat. She couldn't bear to watch him die. She moved a short distance away and sat down, weeping. It seemed that their journey was at an end, that they had been cast out into the wilderness to die. But the story did not end there. In that moment of despair, God heard the cries of Ishmael. The same God who had seen Hagar in her first flight into the wilderness now saw her again. An angel appeared, speaking words of comfort and hope. "Do not be afraid," the angel said, "for God has heard the boy's cry where he lies. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water. It was a lifeline, a sign that they were not abandoned, that their story would continue. Hagar filled the skin with water and gave it to Ishmael, reviving him. In that moment, the future that had seemed so bleak was suddenly filled with promise. Ishmael would survive. He would grow strong in the desert, becoming a skilled archer, and his descendants would indeed become a great nation, just as God had promised. But the bond between father and son, between Abram and Ishmael, had been severed. The tensions of the past had pushed them apart, leaving a legacy of pain and separation that would echo through the generations. For Abram, the decision to send Hagar and Ishmael away was one of the hardest he had ever made. It was a test of his faith, his trust in God's plan, even when that plan seemed to tear his heart apart. But in the end, it was a decision made in obedience, rooted in the belief that God's promises would hold true, even in the face of sorrow and loss. Hagar and Ishmael's journey through the wilderness was not just a physical journey, but a journey of faith, of survival, and ultimately, of divine providence. Their story reminds us that even in the most desolate places, when all seems lost, there is still hope. There is still a future, shaped by the unseen hand of God, who hears, who sees, and who never abandons those he loves. Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness. The desert was endless. Hagar stumbled through the sand, each step heavier than the last. The sun beat down without mercy, turning the world into a furnace. Ishmael, once full of life, now lagged behind, his small body wilting under the unforgiving heat. The bread was long gone, the water skin dry. Every breath was a struggle, every thought consumed by thirst and fear. They had been cast out, sent away with nothing but the barest provisions, and now those had run out. The desert offered no shelter, no respite. It was just Hagar and her son, alone in a vast, uncaring wilderness. Desperation clawed at Hagar's heart. She had tried to stay strong for Ishmael, but now the weight of their situation was crushing her. She could see no way out, no future. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the ground, pulling Ishmael with her. His eyes were dull, his body weak. She couldn't bear it, couldn't bear to watch her son die in this desolate place. She gently laid him under a bush, trying to give him the only bit of shade she could find. Then, she walked away. Not far, just far enough that she wouldn't have to see his final moments. She sat down, her body trembling with exhaustion and grief. Tears blurred her vision as she cried out, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness around her. There was nothing left to do but wait for the end. But in the silence of that desperate moment, something stirred. A sound, faint at first, then growing louder, a voice. It was not the voice of the desert wind, but a voice that spoke with authority and compassion. Hagar lifted her head, her heart pounding. An angel stood before her, his presence a beacon of hope in the midst of her despair. "Do not be afraid," the angel said, his voice steady and kind. "God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift him up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." The words washed over Hagar like a cool breeze, reviving her spirit. God had heard. Even in this forsaken place, God had not abandoned them. The promise given to Abram, the promise that Ishmael would become a great nation, still held true. Hagar felt a surge of strength she hadn't known she still possessed. She rose to her feet, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. The angel pointed, and suddenly, as if by a miracle, Hagar saw it, a well of water. It had been there all along, hidden from her view until this moment of divine revelation. She hurried to the well, her heart racing with renewed hope. She filled the skin with water and rushed back to Ishmael, lifting his head and pouring the life-saving liquid into his parched mouth. The water revived him, bringing color back to his cheeks, life back to his eyes. The desert, which had seemed like a death sentence, was now a place of deliverance. Hagar drank deeply, feeling the coolness spread through her body, giving her the strength to carry on. They would survive. God had seen their suffering, heard their cries, and answered with a promise of life. Ishmael grew strong in the desert. The boy who had once been on the brink of death became a skilled archer, his aim true, his spirit unbreakable. The wilderness, which had once threatened to consume him, became his home, shaping him into a man of resilience and courage. He learned to live off the land, to face its dangers with confidence. The harshness of the desert tempered him, forged him into a man who would one day lead a great nation, just as God had promised. In time, Ishmael married an Egyptian woman, and together they began to build a life. His descendants would become numerous, a fulfillment of the promise made to Hagar, in her darkest hour. Yet, as Ishmael's story unfolded, Hagar's fate became less certain. The Bible leaves her story unresolved, a mystery that lingers at the edges of Ishmael's legacy. Did she find peace in the wilderness, knowing that her son would thrive? Did she ever reconcile with the life she left behind, or did she continue to wander, a solitary figure in the desert? The questions remain, leaving us to wonder about the life of a woman who had been seen by God, who had been saved by divine intervention, yet who ultimately faded from the narrative as her son's story took center stage. Hagar's journey through the wilderness was more than just a physical trek, it was a journey of faith, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit when sustained by divine promise. Her story reminds us that even in the most desolate of places, when all seems lost, there is always hope. God sees, God hears, and God fulfills his promises, even in the midst of the wilderness. And though Hagar's final chapters remain unwritten, her legacy lives on through Ishmael, through the nation that rose from the desert, born out of despair and sustained by faith. The story of Hagar and Ishmael is one of faith and resilience, of human frailty and divine intervention. It shows us the complexities of relationships, the pain of rejection, and the strength found in survival. But more than that, it reveals the unexpected ways in which God's will is fulfilled, even in the harshest of circumstances. In the wilderness, where hope seems distant and the future uncertain, God's presence is revealed in the most profound ways. He sees us, he hears us, and he guides us, even when we feel most alone. As we reflect on this narrative, I invite you to consider how it might speak to your own life. We all face our own wilderness experiences, times when we feel lost, abandoned, or overwhelmed by life's challenges. Yet, just as Hagar discovered, these moments can also be where we encounter God most deeply, where his promises are fulfilled in ways we could never have imagined. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of biblical wisdom. This is Decode Vale, where we uncover the hidden spiritual truths that often go unnoticed. I'd love to hear your thoughts. How does this story resonate with your own experiences? Share your reflections in the comments below. And if you found value in this journey, be sure to subscribe for more content that delves into the spiritual mysteries of the Bible and beyond. Remember, even in the wilderness, God sees you. Until next time, May you find peace in knowing that you are never truly alone.